The Galactic Military Academy's motto was victory through superior planning, which Sarah Chen thought really should have been victory through excessive meetings about planning. She stared at the holographic display of their latest tactical exercise, where her fellow cadets had spent the last 3 hours debating the optimal formation for crossing an empty field. As you can clearly see, droned Cadet X Zilrix, his 4 eyes blinking in perfect sequence as his tentacles manipulated the display. By arranging our troops in a hexagonal dodecahedron pattern while maintaining quantum entanglement between each squad leader, we can maximize our defensive capabilities while. Sarah took another sip of her coffee. Thank God Earth's most vital export was considered a luxury item out here, and wondered, not for the first time, how she'd ended up as the first and only human at the most prestigious military academy in the known universe. Oh right, she'd aced the entrance exam by pointing out that the infamous Battle of Rigel VII could have been avoided if someone had just checked their spam folder for the peace treaty. The Academy's grand halls were filled with the galaxy's finest military minds, representing species that had been waging war among the stars while humans were still figuring out which end of the spear was the pointy one. The Voraxians, with their crystalline bodies and 17-step battle meditation rituals. The Zix Collective, who required each tactical decision to be approved by all 7 of their brain clusters. And the Mepatians, who... Actually, Sarah wasn't entirely sure what the Mepatians did, since they spent most of their time contemplating the philosophical implications of walking forward. Which brings us to subsection Gamma of the preliminary approach. Vector X Zilrix continued, his tentacles now tying themselves in literal knots from excitement. Sarah glanced around the lecture hall. The Voraxian cadets were taking notes so detailed they'd filled 3 quantum data crystals. The Zex representatives were engaged in silent debate with themselves, their eye stalks twitching in complex patterns. Even the Mepatians had paused their existential crisis about chairs to pay attention. You know, Sarah muttered to herself, on Earth we have this radical military doctrine called walking across the damn field. A nearby Voraxian gasped, their crystalline form tinkling in shock. Without calculating the metaphysical implications, without consulting the ancient texts of tactical movement, without even forming a committee. Especially without forming a committee, Sarah replied, taking another long sip of coffee. The Voraxian's crystal facets paled to a horrified pale blue. She'd learned early on that the Academy's approach to military strategy was less about actual fighting and more about creating the most elaborate plan possible. The more unnecessary steps you could add to a simple operation, the better. Sarah had once witnessed a 3-day symposium on the correct method of opening a door during combat operations. The winning presentation had involved 47 distinct steps, 12 prerequisite ceremonies, and at least 3 probability calculations. She'd nearly sprained something, rolling her eyes. But here she was, maintaining her position at the top of her class through what her instructors called disturbing unconventional thinking and what she called basic common sense. The Academy's database held records of every major conflict in galactic history, and as far as Sarah could tell, about 90% of them could have been prevented by someone taking 5 minutes to say, "Hey, what's actually the problem here?" And that concludes the introductory portion of our field crossing strategy, X Zilrix announced proudly. Now, shall we move on to the actual movement calculations? Sarah raised her hand. Quick question, why don't we just check if there's a bridge? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a Mepatian having an existential crisis about the nature of bridges. Welcome to the Galactic Military Academy, where the finest military minds in the universe gathered to turn point A to point B into an advanced calculus problem. Sarah Chen, lone human, coffee addict, and professional eye roller, was about to teach them all a lesson in simplicity. But first, she needed a refill. Grand Admiral Z. Zek Silk's entrance into the Great Hall was heralded by a 40-piece quantum harmonic orchestra, 16 ceremonial light-bearers, and what Sarah was pretty sure was just a guy with a triangle. The Admiral's species was known for having exactly 3 of everything: 3 eyes, 3 arms, 3 legs, and apparently 3 separate titles that all meant basically the same thing. Esteemed future architects of galactic conquest, the Admiral's voice boomed through the hall's perfect acoustic chambers, each syllable echoing exactly 3 times. Sarah wondered if they'd designed it that way on purpose. Your final examination approaches. Z. Zik Silk paused for dramatic effect, all 3 eyes blinking in sequence. You will be tasked with planning a full-scale invasion of a hypothetical enemy force. Your strategies must account for every conceivable variable, every possible outcome, every potential. "Here we go," Sarah whispered into her coffee cup. "Time to break out the 17-dimensional chessboards. And you will present your battle plans before the entire academy in exactly 3 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours." The great hall erupted into excited chittering, crystalline vibrations, and whatever that sound was that the Mapatians made when they were trying to process new information. Sarah watched as her fellow cadets immediately began forming into their strategic planning groups, data pads appearing from various appendages as they started scheduling their scheduling meetings. "Remember," Silk continued, "this challenge will determine not only your final grades but your future positions within the Galactic Defense Force. The most innovative strategy will be awarded the prestigious Order of the Theoretical Tactician, First Class." Sarah counted down from 3. She was picking up some habits, and yep, there it was. The subtle shifting of bodies, tentacles, and crystalline formations, as every other student in her vicinity carefully maneuvered to form study groups that specifically excluded her. She'd seen more subtle evacuation patterns during the Academy's fire drill. "Did you see that?" a Voraxian whispered to their crystalline cluster mate. The human didn't even take out a data pad to record the exact timestamp of the announcement. How can you plan a war without knowing the precise chronological parameters of when you learned about it? Sarah pulled out her ancient paper notebook kept specifically because it made the technology-loving aliens deeply uncomfortable and wrote Step 1, "Don't start a war." She underlined it twice, mostly because she knew the Zix collective members behind her were watching in horror. As her fellow cadets broke into their planning sessions, Sarah could already hear the familiar patterns emerging. The Voraxians were calculating stellar drift patterns to account for their ship's positions over the next 7 centuries. The Zix were debating the philosophical implications of different invasion routes with themselves, and the Mapatians, well, they were still standing in the same spot, but they seemed very intense about it. "The simulation parameters will be distributed to your approved study groups," Silk announced, somehow managing to look at everyone with all 3 eyes simultaneously. Sarah raised her hand. "Question, what if we're not in a study group?" The Admiral's 3 eyes blinked in perfect synchronization. "Not in a, but how would you achieve the mandatory minimum of 300 hours of pre-planning meetings?" "I was thinking of trying this radical new strategy called winging it." The horrified gasps echoed exactly 3 times, and Sarah was pretty sure one of the Mapatians fainted. She made another note in her notebook. Step 2, make more coffee. The galaxy's finest military minds were about to spend 3 weeks planning the perfect war. Sarah Chen was going to spend 3 weeks figuring out how to prevent one. But first, she really needed to find out what that guy with the triangle was all about. The next 2 weeks at the Galactic Military Academy looked like someone had crossed a supercomputer convention with an energy drink addiction. Every flat surface had been commandeered by holograms. Every quantum processor was running hot enough to cook eggs, which Sarah had actually tried, much to everyone's horror, and the library had been transformed into what she could only describe as a war room for planning a war room. "Processing simulation 47,392, announced one of the many AI assistants. Probability of victory 47.82591037482. "Unacceptable," screamed a Voraxian student, their crystalline form vibrating with distress. "We need at least 14 more decimal places of accuracy. Restart." Sarah, meanwhile, had claimed her usual spot in the cafeteria, feet propped up on a chair, nursing her 5th cup of coffee while watching the chaos unfold. Her only companion was Bob, a maintenance bot who'd been assigned to clean the cafeteria but seemed to spend most of his time questioning his programming. "I do not understand," Bob said, his single optical sensor focused on a group of Zeks who were currently arguing with themselves about the correct shade of red to use in their threat assessment diagrams. "My databases indicate that wars are won through action, yet they simulate without end." "That's because," Sarah replied, drawing a stick figure in her notebook, "they're trying to plan for every possible thing that could go wrong instead of figuring out what could go right." She added a little coffee cup to her stick figure's hand. "Query, is this why you are not participating in the simulations?" "Nope. I'm not participating because I'm busy solving the actual problem." She flipped her notebook around to show Bob her doodles, which now included a flowchart that consisted entirely of boxes with the words, "Don't start a war," connected by arrows to other boxes saying, "Seriously, just don't." The maintenance bot's head tilted exactly 45 degrees to the right. Error: this does not compute with standard military doctrine. Neither does common sense. Apparently Sarah watched as a team of Mapatians rolled past, pushing a quantum whiteboard covered in calculations about the metaphysical implications of pressing a button. You know what the funny thing is, Bob? I've been reading through the historical archives of every major galactic conflict, and you know what they all have in common? Calculating. Common elements include superior firepower, strategic positioning, resource allocation. Nope, Sarah popped the P sound, making a nearby Voraxian wince at the acoustic imperfection. They all started because someone got their feelings hurt, and nobody bothered to ask, "Hey, what's wrong?" At that moment, Professor K. Thrix, a being composed entirely of shifting probability clouds, materialized next to their table. Sarah had always found it funny that a species that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty could be so absolutely certain about everything. Cadet Chen. The professor's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I notice your name is not registered on any of the quantum simulation servers. Your project group has not requisitioned any computational resources. You have not even submitted a request for a preliminary planning committee to plan your planning committees. That's correct. Professor Sarah sketched a little probability cloud on her paper and gave it angry eyebrows. This is most concerning. The final presentation is in 9 days, and you have shown no evidence of preparation. Oh, I'm preparing. She held up her coffee cup. This is my 6th cup today. That's 2 more than yesterday. The professor's probability cloud swirled in what Sarah had learned to recognize as academic distress. Cadet Chen, this examination will determine your future in the Galactic Defense Force. Are you not taking it seriously? Actually, Professor, I'd say I'm the only one taking it seriously. She pointed to a group of students who had just rushed past with what appeared to be a scale model of an entire star system. Everyone else is so busy planning the perfect war that they've forgotten to ask if we need one. Query Bob interjected, his optical sensor switching between Sarah and the professor. Is not the purpose of a military academy to teach warfare? The purpose, Sarah said, pulling out a datapad for the first time in days, is to teach military strategy. And sometimes the best strategy is to avoid the fight altogether. She showed them her screen, displaying statistics from the last 50 galactic conflicts. Look at these casualty numbers. Now look at the initial causes of each war. Notice anything? The professor's clouds condensed slightly as they studied the data. The correlation appears significant. Most of these wars started over what were essentially misunderstandings. Damaged pride. Crossed wires. One of them started because someone sent a diplomatic message with the wrong emoji. She put down her coffee cup. But everyone's so busy planning how to fight that they never stop to think about how not to. This is unorthodox, Professor K. Thrix wavered. Welcome to humanity, Professor. We specialized in unorthodox long before we figured out which end of the stick was pointy. After the professor had drifted away in a state of quantum confusion, Bob's optical sensor focused on Sarah's notebook again. Query, what is your actual strategy for the presentation? Sarah grinned and flipped to a new page in her notebook. Oh, I have a plan, and it's going to make everyone's heads explode. Some of them literally, in the case of the explodians. She paused. But first, I'm going to need more coffee. And maybe a triangle player. The grand auditorium of theoretical combat buzzed with anticipation, its quantum-enhanced acoustics somehow managing to make even nervous shuffling sound dramatic. Sarah sat in the back row with Bob, who had been drafted into service as her tactical support unit. Really, she just wanted someone to share her running commentary with. Presenting first, announced Grand Admiral Zieg Zilk's 3-toned voice, the combined strategic initiative of Voraxian excellence. 5 crystalline forms floated onto the stage, their facets arranged in what Sarah recognized as their most serious geometric configuration. Bob, she whispered, want to bet they start with a 4-dimensional flowchart. Processing bet declined. Historical data suggests 98.7% probability. The lead Voraxian activated their holographic display, and yep, there it was. A flowchart so complex it required multiple planes of existence to properly display. Our strategy begins with the preliminary pre-invasion preparation phase. The Voraxian chimed, their crystalline form vibrating with pride. First, we will need to construct exactly 1 million quantum-synchronized battle meditation chambers. Sarah pulled out her notebook and started a tally. 1 drink for every time they say quantum, 2 for synergistic paradigm. Query: is this not a waste of perfectly good coffee? Bold of you to assume I'm drinking coffee right now. The Voraxian presentation continued for 3 hours, including a 15-minute break to recalibrate the holographic projectors that had overheated from displaying too many probability matrices simultaneously. Their supply line logistics alone required 3 separate AI systems to calculate, and their proposed battle formations looked like someone had given a geometry textbook an anxiety disorder. Next up were the Zix Collective, all 7 brain clusters working in perfect harmony as they presented their strategy, which seemed to primarily involve reorganizing the enemy's filing system into chaos. And by implementing our patented bureaucratic warfare protocol. All 7 Zix representatives spoke in unison. We will ensure that the enemy's requisition forms for ammunition will be filed under M for military supplies and A for ammunition, thus creating a quantum uncertainty about their actual location. Bob, Sarah muttered, remind me to introduce them to the concept of digital copies. Noted. Though I calculate this would cause an existential crisis in 73% of the audience. The Mepatians took the stage next, though it took them 20 minutes to resolve their philosophical debate about whether the stage truly existed. Their strategy involved what they called deep contemplative combat. By engaging the enemy in simultaneous philosophical debates about the nature of existence, the Mepatian speaker droned, we can paralyze their forces with existential uncertainty. Observe our simulation. The holographic display showed 2 armies meeting on a battlefield, then sitting down to discuss whether the battlefield was really there, and if so, did it have feelings about being fought upon? I mean, Sarah scribbled in her notebook, points for pacifism, even if it's accidental. As the day wore on, the presentations became increasingly elaborate. The quantum probability clouds Sarah could never remember their actual species name presented a strategy that existed in 17 different timelines simultaneously. The harmonious collective of strategic excellence Sarah was pretty sure they'd just picked random impressive-sounding words, had developed a battle plan so complex it had achieved sentience, and had to be talked out of launching its own invasion. Next up, Admiral Zilk announced. The combined forces of all 3 eyes blinked in confusion. It appears Cadet Chen has registered as a solo presenter. The audience erupted into whispers. Solo presentations were unheard of. The paperwork alone usually required at least 3 beings to complete. Query: Bob's optical sensor dimmed with concern. You have prepared appropriate visual aids in quantum calculations. Sarah patted her notebook. Nope. But I did bring this sweet triangle I borrowed from the orchestra. Error: unable to compute strategic value of percussion instrument. That's because you're thinking like a military bot. She stood up, stretching casually as the whispers around them grew more intense. Tell me, Bob, in all these presentations today, what's the one thing nobody has mentioned? Bob's processor's word. Calculating. Presentations have covered logistics, strategy, tactics, supply lines, battle formations, quantum entanglement, philosophical implications, bureaucratic warfare. Exactly. But what about the actual people we're supposedly fighting? Has anyone even asked who they are or what they want? Query: is this relevant to military strategy? Sarah grinned, tucking her notebook under her arm as she headed for the stage. Bob, my friend, it's the only thing relevant to military strategy. Everything else is just really expensive thinking about thinking. She passed the Voraxian team, who were still trying to shut down their quantum processors before they achieved singularity. The Zix representatives were already filing preliminary objections to her presentation format in triplicate. The Mepatians had entered a group meditation on the nature of presentations themselves. Good luck. Cadet Chen. Professor Kathrix's probability clouds formed what might have been a concerned expression. Though I calculate the chances of a successful solo presentation without quantum computational support to be approximately. Sarah pulled out her triangle and gave it a single, perfect ting. Never tell me the odds, Professor. Humans find them inspiring in exactly the wrong way. As she approached the stage, Grand Admiral Zilk's 3 eyes narrowed in synchronization. The entire auditorium held its breath, except for the gaseous species, who had been holding their breath all day as part of their battle meditation. Sarah Chen, lone human, armed with nothing but a notebook and a percussion instrument, was about to present her strategy for galactic warfare. The triangle gleamed under the quantum lights. Sarah had a feeling it was going to be a very interesting presentation. Sarah approached the podium with all the casual confidence of someone who either had everything figured out or nothing to lose. The entire auditorium watched in horror as she placed a single sheet of paper on the quantum-enhanced presentation surface, which immediately started throwing error messages about insufficient data density. "Greetings, esteemed faculty and fellow students," Sarah began, giving the triangle a gentle ting for emphasis. "I've listened to everyone's extremely thorough presentations today about how to wage the perfect war. Now, I'd like to present my strategy for winning it." She held up her paper. The quantum projectors, desperately trying to find something more complicated to display, created a 100-foot hologram of her simple flowchart. "Don't start a war connected to seriously. Just don't." The audience erupted. Several Voraxians nearly shattered from shock. The Zix collective began filing emergency procedures for emergency procedures. The Mepatians hadn't blinked in so long Sarah was getting worried about them. Cadet Chen Grand Admiral Zieg Zilk's three voices managed to sound simultaneously confused, angry, and intrigued. "Explain yourself." Gladly, Sarah pulled out her ancient datapad, the one that had made tech specialists cry, because it still used physical buttons. "I've spent the last 3 weeks doing something radical, actually reading our enemy's communication attempts." She pressed a button, and the holographic display shifted to show transmission logs. While everyone else was planning increasingly complicated ways to blow things up, I noticed something interesting. The supposed enemy has been trying to contact us. A lot. Like really a lot. They've sent exactly 47,392 attempted communication signals. A Voraxian student gasped. "That's the exact number of combat simulations we ran." Funny coincidence, isn't it? Almost like for every simulation of how to fight them, they were trying to figure out how to talk to us. Sarah clicked to the next screen. But here's where it gets really interesting. I had Bob help me analyze their transmission patterns. Bob's optical sensor glowed with what might have been pride. Turns out they're not sending battle plans or threats. They're sending party invitations. The silence in the auditorium was so complete you could hear a quantum probability cloud's uncertainty principle fluctuate. "You see," Sarah continued, pulling up the historical archives, "I did some digging into every major galactic conflict in the past 1,000 years. The Rigel VII catastrophe started because someone's translation matrix confused 'let's have dinner' with 'let's have war'. The Great Nebula conflict, triggered by a misunderstanding about proper tentacle etiquette at a diplomatic function. The infamous Zeta Reticuli campaign. Someone sent a kissy face emoji when they meant to send a smiley face." She began displaying historical records, one after another. Every single one of these wars started because of a misunderstanding that could have been resolved with a 5-minute conversation. But instead, everyone jumped straight to planning elaborate battle strategies. Professor Cathrix's probability cloud swirled in academic distress. But what about the honor of combat? The glory of tactical superiority? "Oh, I'm not saying we shouldn't be prepared for a fight," Sarah replied, giving the triangle another ting. "But maybe, just maybe, we should try talking first. I mean, look at this." She pulled up the enemy's most recent transmission, which her basic human translation matrix had easily decoded. "Please respond. We are trying to invite you to our millennium celebration of peace and understanding. We have cake." "They have cake," a young Voraxian whispered in awe. "They have cake," Sarah confirmed. But because everyone was so busy planning for war, nobody bothered to read their messages. "We've got a species out there literally trying to throw a party, and we're all sitting here calculating the most efficient ways to blow them up." She turned to face the Grand Admiral. "Sir, with all due respect, I've completed the assignment. You asked us to plan a strategy for dealing with a hypothetical enemy force. My strategy is simple. Step 1, check if they're actually an enemy. Step 2, if they're not, go have cake. Step 3, if they are, try talking to them before we start shooting. Because let's be honest, war is expensive, messy, and really cuts into coffee break time." The chaos that followed was spectacular. The Varaxians were frantically recalculating their entire strategic doctrine. The Zix collective had to spawn an 8th brain cluster just to process this new paradigm. The Mepatians had achieved a new level of existential crisis that technically qualified as a separate plane of existence. But Admiral Zilk sputtered, "Where are your quantum calculations? Your probability matrices? Your 17-step preliminary engagement protocols?" Sarah held up her triangle. "Sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. Watch this." She sent a simple reply to the enemy transmission, "Sorry for the delay. We'd love to come to your party. Should we bring anything?" The response was immediate, appearing on the giant holographic display for all to see. "Wonderful. No need to bring anything except yourselves and a desire for friendship. Though if you happen to have any of that amazing human coffee we've heard about." The auditorium erupted into chaos again, but a different kind this time. The Varaxians were already calculating the optimal cake-cutting formations. The Zix were drafting party planning committees. Even the Mepatians had snapped out of their existential crisis long enough to debate the philosophical implications of frosting. Sarah turned back to the stunned audience. "So to summarize my strategy, victory through superior conversation. Also coffee diplomacy, which I'm pretty sure is now officially a thing." She gave the triangle one final ting. "Any questions?" A forest of hands, tentacles, probability clouds, and other appendages shot up. "Just one follow-up question," Sarah added with a grin. "Who wants to help me load up the coffee makers for the peace party?" And that was how Sarah Chen, armed with nothing but common sense and a percussion instrument, prevented a war and started an intergalactic coffee appreciation society. The triangle, by unanimous vote, became the official instrument of diplomatic relations. The silence following Sarah's presentation lasted exactly 3 minutes. She timed it on her ancient Earth watch, just for fun. It was finally broken by Grand Admiral Zilk clearing all 3 of their throats simultaneously. "Cadet Chen," the Admiral's voice resonated through the hall, "your presentation was unconventional." "Thank you, sir." It completely ignored standard military protocol. "Yes, sir. It made a mockery of our traditional strategic planning processes." "That's fair, sir." And it was, according to every measurable metric and outcome-based analysis, all 3 eyes closed in what appeared to be physical pain. Technically correct. Which is, as we all know, the best kind of correct. The stunned silence transformed into confused murmuring. Bob's optical sensor was spinning so fast it had created a small light show. Furthermore, Silk continued, "The success rate of your proposed strategy, based on historical data, appears to be significantly higher than our traditional approach of calculating things to death before anyone actually does anything." Sarah raised her coffee cup in salute. "Sometimes the best battle plan is no battle plan, sir." Indeed, the Admiral's 3-sided medals clinked thoughtfully. "The Academy Board has reached a decision. Cadet Sarah Chen, for your unprecedented approach to conflict resolution and your innovative use of percussion instruments in diplomacy, you are hereby awarded the Order of the Theoretical Tactician, First Class, with a special commendation in applied common sense." 1 semester later, Sarah stood at the front of her own classroom in the newly established Department of Preventative Diplomacy, watching her first batch of students file in. The room had been specially modified to include both quantum computing stations and a fully stocked coffee bar. "Welcome to Warfare Prevention 101, she announced, taking a long sip from her world's okayest diplomat mug, a graduation gift from Bob. "Today's lesson: why starting a war is like using reply all on an office email. You think it's a good idea at the time, but everyone ends up regretting it." On her desk, next to a pile of historical case studies and diplomatic protocols, sat a gleaming triangle. It had been officially certified as a Class 1 diplomatic tool and was now required equipment for all senior military officers. Sarah smiled as she saw a young Varaxian tentatively pick up a coffee cup, while a Mepatian nearby contemplated the existential implications of creamer. Change was coming to the galaxy, 1 cup of coffee at a time. And somewhere in the maintenance corridors, Bob was probably still trying to compute the strategic value of a triangle. Some mysteries, Sarah decided, were best left unsolved.